Imagine the galaxy's deadliest empire facing a pirate whose only weapons are wit, luck, and audacity. What happens when Jack Sparrow sails into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium? Battles with daemons, negotiations with aliens, and escapes that defy reality. Nothing is safe, nothing is predictable. Will the Black Pearl survive the warp, or will Jack's legendary luck finally run out?
Jack Sparrow had always thought the sea was unpredictable, but nothing could have prepared him for the swirling chaos that surrounded the Black Pearl as it drifted beyond the stars. One moment he was chasing a rival ship through familiar waters, and the next the sky had fractured into colors that had no name, waves of light and shadow rolling like molten glass. The compass spun wildly, ignoring every law of navigation Jack thought he understood, and the wind carried whispers that seemed almost alive, brushing against his ears with promises and threats. The crew muttered prayers in half-forgotten tongues, and even the oldest sailor aboard, Gibbs, looked paler than the moon, clutching the rail as if the very ship might unravel under his hands. Jack leaned on the quarterdeck, squinting into the shimmer of the warp, grinning despite himself, because he could almost feel that luck, his peculiar, impossible luck, was about to be tested in ways no mortal sea could conjure. The Black Pearl shuddered violently, as though the ship itself sensed the alien currents tugging at its timbers. Every creak and groan became a chorus of warning, and Jack's boots slid against the slick deck while he waved a hand at the horizon, half in jest, half in command, even though the horizon no longer resembled anything he had ever seen. Shadows darted beneath the ship, shapes that moved like living ink, too fluid to be called solid. Gibbs muttered something about devils, but Jack only laughed, tipping his hat back as he scanned the waves of color. There was danger here, yes, but Jack had never turned down danger. It was the lifeblood of a pirate, the thrill of the impossible chase, and somehow he felt that this place, the warp, was tailor-made for someone who lived for chaos and cleverness. The compass twirled again, settling briefly before spinning anew, and Jack, ever the gambler, made a wager with fate that he would bend this strange sea to his will. Time itself seemed to warp along with the currents. Minutes stretched into eternities and then snapped back in a heartbeat, leaving Jack with a dizzying sense of vertigo that made the air shimmer around him. The Black Pearl responded to his commands with the sluggish obedience of a creature caught between worlds, sails stretching and twisting like translucent wings, ropes writhing as though alive. He barked orders, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crew, but even he could hear the strange music of the warp, a hum beneath all sound that spoke directly to the mind, tugging at memories and fears. Jack's grin faltered briefly as he felt a tingle along his spine, the sort of sensation that had killed lesser men, but he shook it off, spinning the wheel with a flourish, trusting instinct and luck over reason. Somewhere deep inside him, he knew that navigating the warp would not be a matter of maps or charts, but of cunning, courage, and the uncanny ability to talk one's way out of the jaws of cosmic horror.
Shapes loomed ahead, grotesque and impossible, yet fleeting. Towering spires of black stone floated above the endless waves, dripping with what looked like molten gold, twisting skyward and downward at the same time. The crew whispered prayers, crossed themselves, and muttered about monsters, but Jack leaned over the rail, eyes wide with fascination, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Now this," he said softly, "this is a voyage worth remembering." The ship rocked as if acknowledging him, and he could feel the subtle nudges of the currents pushing him toward unknown dangers. Lightning-like streaks of raw energy lanced across the sky, illuminating faces twisted with awe and fear. And Jack felt the thrill of the hunt, even though there was nothing to hunt, nothing to fight, yet. Every instant told him that survival would be more than mere skill. It would be a game of wit against forces that did not think in terms of life and death. The Black Pearl was no longer just a ship. It was a participant in the chaotic dance of the warp, a player in a story far bigger than any pirate had ever imagined. Even as he laughed at the absurdity of the situation, Jack could feel a subtle, almost imperceptible presence brushing against the edges of his mind, probing with curiosity and malice. The air seemed thicker, denser, and the strange hum beneath the waves grew louder, punctuated by whispers he could almost understand. They spoke in riddles, offering secrets of fortune and ruin, and Jack found himself nodding as if he were in conversation with an old acquaintance, making promises he wasn't entirely sure he could keep. The crew shivered, but Jack thrived on this tension, this constant balance between peril and opportunity. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, though he knew it would do little against the incomprehensible forces that lurked beyond the veil. Still, it was the gesture that mattered, the signal to the universe that Jack Sparrow was here, and he would not be cowed, no matter what horrors waited in the depths of the warp.
The Black Pearl emerged from the turbulent eddies of the warp into a world that smelled of rot and incense, a planet swallowed by perpetual twilight. Jagged spires jutted from the barren ground like broken teeth, dripping with dark ichor, while shadows twisted unnaturally, moving as if alive. Jack Sparrow stepped onto the deck, squinting through the haze, his boots crunching on the warped timbers as he studied the distant figures moving below. They were garbed in tattered robes, symbols of chaos etched into their flesh in glowing inks that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Gibbs muttered something about not a place for men of God or men of luck, but Jack's grin only widened. Chaos, he thought, always makes for interesting company, and he rather liked interesting. With a hand on his hat, he leaned over the rail, observing the cultists as they chanted in a cadence that made the air hum, and he felt the thrill of a new adventure stir in his chest, a mixture of dread, amusement, and sheer uncontainable curiosity. As the Pearl drifted closer to the shore, the cultists noticed the ship, their voices rising in manic unison, summoning energies that warped the very air around them. The ground quaked under invisible weight, and Jack could see the shallows writhing, forming shapes too grotesque for his mind to fully comprehend. Tentacles of darkness snaked outward, curling toward the Pearl, yet they recoiled slightly, as if uncertain how to interact with something so peculiar. Jack tilted his head, squinting, then tapped the hilt of his sword and laughed softly. Well, they don't seem too organized. A pity, really, because chaos loves a good mess, doesn't it? Gibbs shivered at the mention, but Jack merely waved him off, striding toward the bow as the chants grew louder. The air was thick with psychic tension, pressing against every thought, and Jack found himself instinctively weaving through his own chaotic mind, calculating, bluffing, improvising, and smiling all at once, as if daring the universe to throw something he couldn't handle. The first cultist reached the shoreline, hands raised toward the sky, and a dark light flickered across the horizon. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from recognition. These people were dangerous, yes, but predictable in their fanaticism. He took a step forward, boots scraping against the deck, letting the subtle sway of the Pearl carry him closer. "Evening, mates," he called, voice carrying with practiced bravado. "Care to invite me for a spot of tea, or is it only sacrifices tonight?" The cultists froze, unsure whether to attack or continue their ritual, and in that hesitation, Jack sensed the advantage. He moved with the fluidity of a predator, one hand on his sword, the other gesturing grandly, spinning lies and half-truths like nets, weaving an invisible trap around the unwary followers of chaos. Gibbs muttered prayers, while Jack's grin widened as a small demon flickered at the edge of sight, curious about this mortal who dared step so casually into its den.
The chanting rose to a fevered pitch, the air shimmering as if the veil between worlds was thinning. Jack could feel the pull of the warp, tugging at his very soul, testing his sanity, whispering promises of power and ruin in equal measure. He laughed, the sound cutting through the ritual like a knife, and made a show of swinging lightly on the rigging, hat tilted and swagger exaggerated. The cultists faltered, confused by the audacity, unsure if he was a madman or a sorcerer in disguise. Jack took advantage of their uncertainty, tossing a small smoke bomb from his coat with a flourish that sent a plume curling into the sky, obscuring vision and breaking the rhythm of their spell. "Nothing like a bit of theatrics," he muttered, watching shadows twist and writhe as the cultists reeled, their dark energies momentarily unstable. The air pulsed with tension, and Jack's heart raced, not from fear, but from the delicious thrill of survival on a knife's edge, dancing with forces that could snap him like a twig with a single mistake. From the shadows, twisted shapes began to emerge, hulking forms of worshippers whose bodies bore mutations that no sane mind should endure. Claws, horns, and eyes in impossible places stared at him, yet Jack simply tipped his hat, giving a mock bow, and sauntered closer to the gangplank. "Gentlemen," he said, voice smooth as rum, "I seem to have arrived uninvited. Mind terribly if I take a look around?" The cultists hissed and waved their hands, summoning flickers of flame and darkness, but Jack danced between them with effortless precision, relying on instinct and luck, the pearl groaning in approval beneath him. Gibbs clutched the railing, muttering about the end of days, while Jack twirled his sword and winked at a particularly large, horned figure that seemed almost insulted by his irreverence. For a moment he thought he might have gone too far, but then chaos had never been averse to a good joke. As the first true wave of psychic energy surged, Jack felt his mind stretch and pull, memories mixing with possibilities, his sense of time dissolving into endless options. Yet he remained calm, laughing softly as if speaking to an old friend. The cultists faltered again, unsure whether this stranger was cursed or blessed, mortal or daemon adjacent, and Jack seized the opening, leaping onto the dock with exaggerated flair. Now, let's all take a breath, shall we? I promise I'm not here for trouble. Well, not much trouble." The shadows writhed, and whispers in languages he could not name circled his thoughts, but Jack only grinned, ever aware that in the warp, a sharp tongue and a quicker mind could be the difference between walking away and feeding the shadows, and he intended to walk, dance, and perhaps sail away if luck held.
The moment the black pearl slipped from the mists of the warp into real space, a pulse of Imperial sensors detected her presence, alerting fleets stationed in the sector to an unregistered vessel bristling with unusual signatures. Jack Sparrow, ever oblivious to the finer points of galactic bureaucracy, leaned casually on the rail, squinting at the distant glint of Imperial cruisers converging on his position. Their engines burned coldly against the vacuum, disciplined, precise, and utterly intimidating. The Pearl, by contrast, floated like a drunken gull, sails tattered, timbers creaking in ways that defied engineering logic. Jack tipped his hat, smiling slyly. "Ah, lads in shiny armor. Do come closer. The closer the better for conversation, don't you think?" Gibbs muttered curses and clutched the wheel as alarms rang across the deck, but Jack only chuckled, fully aware that negotiations, or perhaps chaos, were about to begin in ways that only he could orchestrate. Imperial voidcraft moved with the cold grace of a predator closing on prey, and Jack could see the figures aboard, rigid silhouettes behind reinforced viewports, undoubtedly analyzing his every move, their minds trained to hunt anomalies like him. He leaned casually against the rigging, letting his swagger do the talking while gauging the psychological battlefield. These were no mere pirates, no common marauders. These were agents of an empire that demanded obedience, loyalty, and death for disobedience. Yet Jack, with his uncanny ability to thrive in absurdity, treated it as a game, a dance on a razor's edge. "Gentlemen," he called out, voice carrying across the void, "I'm not here to plunder, at least until we've had proper introductions." The words were laced with mock civility, each syllable designed to provoke, confuse, and charm in equal measure. Gibbs groaned behind him, knowing well that diplomacy in Jack's hands was an unpredictable beast. The Imperial ships fired interrogation flares, each one burning with the precise fury of disciplined ordnance, and Jack flinched slightly, more from habit than fear. He caught the glint of reflected light off polished armor through the viewport of the nearest cruiser and smirked. "Oh, they're impressed," he whispered to Gibbs, "or maybe just confused. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." The Pearl, as if aware of its master's intentions, danced nimbly between void currents, responding to his every whim with exaggerated creaks and groans. Jack could almost hear the ship laughing with him, and he leaned into the thrill, aware that the Imperium valued control above all else, yet control was exactly what he intended to undermine, if only with words, charm, and a little creative misdirection. The flares sparked and hissed, and Jack raised a hand in theatrical surrender, bowing mockingly as if performing on a stage built for gods and tyrants. A boarding shuttle dropped silently from the nearest cruiser, engines humming with grim precision. Jack's eyes flicked to the tiny silhouette descending against the backdrop of stars, and he tipped his hat, grinning, "And here come the welcoming committee. How delightful!" Gibbs muttered that it would be the last thing they do, but Jack only waved a hand as the shuttle docked clumsily, crew inside preparing for confrontation. He sauntered forward, sword in hand, voice smooth as rum as he called out, "Now, no need for swords yet. I'm an uninvited guest, sure, but manners still matter, don't they?" The Imperial officers froze, taken aback by the audacity of a single human, speaking to the instruments of the galaxy's might as if they were old drinking companions rather than enforcers of death. Jack's grin widened, fully aware that fear, confusion, and a hint of amusement were powerful weapons, ones he wielded as deftly as any blade. The shuttle doors opened with a hiss, revealing armored figures whose eyes, even behind visors, seemed to burn with disciplined fury. Jack stepped closer to the gangway, arms spread in mock welcome, eyes darting from figure to figure, reading their expressions with the precision of a gambler calculating odds. "Now, gentlemen," he said, voice rich with casual authority, "let's not be hasty. We might find common ground, or at least common entertainment." Gibbs shook his head, muttering that the man was mad, but Jack thrived in this tension, savoring it like a fine cigar. Every twitch, every micro-expression, every hesitation in their disciplined movements was a clue, a tiny opening to be exploited with words, wit, and showmanship, and Jack was nothing if not a master of exploiting openings. As the first officer stepped forward, sword drawn, Jack gave a theatrical bow, sword tapping the deck lightly. The moment was thick with tension, charged with the cold precision of the Imperium and the chaotic, unpredictable energy of Jack Sparrow. The void shimmered around them, stars twinkling like watchful eyes, and Jack could almost feel the subtle currents of fate bending slightly under his audacity. He flourished his hat, letting it catch the strange light of the warp-tinged void, and spoke softly, yet audibly across the gap. "I come in peace, mostly, and if we can avoid bloodshed, all the better for storytelling." Gibbs muttered that storytelling wouldn't matter if they were dead, but Jack only laughed softly, already calculating the path between obedience, survival, and inevitable chaos. The officers paused, uncertain how to respond to a pirate whose arrogance matched his audacity. Jack took a slow step toward the gangway, each movement deliberate, a dance of confidence and mischief designed to disarm, confuse, and charm. "Now, I trust we can discuss terms over something stronger than this vacuum. Rum, perhaps?" he asked, voice rich with irony, knowing full well the Imperium rarely drank. Yet the suggestion, absurd as it was, created a pause, and in that hesitation Jack saw the advantage. His grin widened, sword twirling idly, eyes bright with the thrill of the impossible game he always played, negotiating survival against impossible odds with nothing but words, luck, and charisma. All while the cold machinery of the galaxy's greatest empire waited, curious, threatened, and uncertain.
The Black Pearl drifted closer to the outskirts of a battered asteroid field, a haven for smugglers, pirates, and traders of every conceivable hue. Jack Sparrow leaned casually against the rail, one boot resting on a coil of rope, eyes scanning the assortment of vessels clinging to the shadows like barnacles. Ork warbands in jagged, rusted hulks bellowed their greetings in guttural tones, while sleek Eldar skimmers glided past with practiced elegance, their curves defying gravity and expectation alike. Even a small contingent of Tau barges lingered, their technology humming with a precise, alien rhythm. Jack tipped his hat, eyes glinting, and murmured, "Ah, such a welcoming committee. Nothing like a bit of variety to make a man feel at home." Gibbs muttered that they were mad folk, but Jack only grinned, already sensing the opportunities and dangers mingling in the void like spices on a stew. Each interaction a gamble, each negotiation a duel played with words, charm, and the occasional touch of luck. Jack stepped onto the gangplank of a stationary Ork barge, boots clattering over metal plating. A hulking Ork with yellowed tusks leaned down, sniffing the air, confused by the aroma of rum and salt clinging to Jack like armor. "Good evening, friend," Jack said, voice smoothed, tipping his hat with practiced flair. "I seem to have arrived with little more than a ship and a penchant for the unusual. Perhaps we might barter." The Ork blinked once, twice, and grunted, scratching its head, clearly unaccustomed to anyone speaking with such brazen politeness. Gibbs muttered that Jack was insane, but Jack simply smiled, already mapping the negotiation in his mind. With Xenos, he knew, the rules were flexible, more a dance than a duel. Words were weapons as deadly as claws, and Jack Sparrow wielded them with unmatched precision. Across the void, an Eldar craft glimmered like a shard of light caught in a shadow. Jack raised a hand in mock salute as the pilot descended onto a docking platform, eyes like polished gems scrutinizing him with unreadable calm. "Ah, elegance itself," Jack murmured, stepping forward with exaggerated grace. "Might we exchange curiosities, trinkets, or perhaps knowledge? I have stories to trade as well, if the price is fair." The Eldar regarded him with that calm, almost predatory patience, yet Jack could see the subtle twitch of interest in their posture. Even centuries of wisdom could not ignore the strange, chaotic energy that clung to him. Gibbs muttered prayers under his breath, convinced the conversation would end with them as little more than space dust, but Jack only winked, moving with the fluidity of a man dancing on the edge of catastrophe.
Jack's dealings with the Tau contingent were yet another layer of complexity. Their armor gleamed, and their voices carried the precision of calculation, each word chosen for efficiency and effect. Jack listened with a grin, tilting his head as they offered trade routes and rare technology, their terms exacting and unfamiliar. He countered with promises of salvage, intelligence, and tales of treasures hidden in the warp. Each gesture, each flourish of speech was calculated to intrigue, amuse, and confuse. Gibbs watched, pale and muttering, but Jack thrived on this tension, balancing charm with cunning and, when necessary, bluff with daring. He knew Xenos were creatures of pride, logic, and occasionally greed, and he intended to exploit each weakness with the practiced hand of a pirate born to gamble on impossibility. The exchange reached its peak when an Ork boss bellowed approval, or was it threat, over a deal that involved scrap metal, rum, and a stolen cog from a Mechanicus shrine. Jack danced lightly over crates, tipping his hat, voice rolling like velvet across the deck. "Excellent, my green friend. You've agreed to terms that may or may not exist, but we'll call it a victory nonetheless." The Ork scratched its head, confused, while Eldar and Tau observers tilted their heads in fascination, sensing that Jack's survival depended not on weapons, but on sheer unpredictability and audacity. Gibbs muttered about the end of days again, but Jack only laughed softly, enjoying the absurdity of diplomacy played like a game of cards with a deck that constantly reshuffled itself, each new hand a gamble of survival, influence, and perhaps profit. As the Black Pearl prepared to depart, Jack observed the strange network of alliances, grudges, and rivalries woven between these alien traders. He nodded knowingly, tipping his hat once more to the Eldar pilot, who inclined their head in acknowledgement, a silent concession to the pirate's audacity. "I do believe we've left a mark," Jack whispered to Gibbs, eyes scanning the asteroid field like a hunter sizing up prey. "Or perhaps we've merely entertained them. Either way, it's been profitable." The crew muttered, some in awe, others in fear, as Jack mapped out the next leg of their journey through the void, knowing that Xenos, or even the Imperium, would watch, study, and perhaps pursue them. And Jack, naturally, intended to remain just out of reach, laughing all the way through the cosmic dance of risk, deception, and impossible luck.
Jack Sparrow peered through the viewport of the Black Pearl as the derelict space hulk loomed ahead, massive and fractured, a floating city of death twisted by centuries of warp taint and neglect. The hull glimmered faintly in the void, jagged metal spires jutting out like the broken teeth of some colossal beast. He swirled a finger through the condensation on the glass, leaving a crooked trail, and grinned. "Ah, there she is," he muttered to Gibbs, "home of treasure and trouble in equal measure." The crew shifted uneasily, sensing the oppressive psychic weight radiating from the wreck, muttering prayers to whatever gods would listen. Even Jack could feel it, the tug at the edge of his mind, whispers of power, wealth, and death entwined. Yet he thrived in this, as the thrill of a true hunt always sharpened his wits and strengthened his resolve, and he knew the Pearl could dance through these dangers if he led it correctly. The airlock hissed open as Jack and his small boarding party stepped onto the twisted metal decks, their boots clanging against surfaces warped and jagged, twisted by the energies of the warp. Shadows seemed to slither across walls where no light reached, and faint whispers tugged at their thoughts, promising glory or despair depending on the choice of the listener. Jack grinned, spinning his sword lazily in one hand. "Fear, my friends, is the seasoning for adventure," he said, voice dripping with charm, as the crew flinched and nodded. He led them down corridors choked with wreckage and rust, scanning constantly, eyes darting between traps, anomalies, and glimpses of movement that might have been the flicker of a daemon or a trick of the mind. Gibbs muttered about the dead watching, but Jack waved him off, tiptoeing over debris like a cat, every step calculated, yet exuding an effortless swagger that made danger look almost amusing. They reached the central chamber, a cathedral-like space warped by centuries of psychic energy. Patches of glowing ichor ran along the walls, pooling in strange, pulsing patterns. The relic they sought was said to be at the heart of this place, a device of immense power, capable of bending fortune to the will of whoever held it. Jack's eyes sparkled, both with greed and the thrill of the impossible. He could feel the energy radiating through the air, tugging at his mind in tantalizing whispers. He gestured for the crew to stay back as he stepped forward, hat tilted, boots crunching softly over the warped floor. "Now then," he murmured, "let's see if the stories do it justice." Every instinct screamed danger, but instinct and luck were Jack's constant companions, and he felt the familiar thrill of outwitting forces far larger and far stranger than himself. A sudden hiss of movement drew his attention. A shadow flickered across the chamber, massive and alien. Jack froze, then tilted his head, smiling slyly. "Well, someone wants to play," he whispered, spinning his sword in a lazy arc. The creature emerged, limbs twisted, claws glinting with a light not of this world, eyes alight with hunger. Gibbs raised his weapon, muttering about death being too polite for what awaited them, but Jack stepped forward with extricated confidence, voice ringing out, Now, no need for introductions. I'm Jack Sparrow, and I prefer my enemies polite." The creature paused, momentarily confused by the audacity of the mortal, and Jack grinned wider, sensing the opening. In the warp, audacity was sometimes more powerful than steel, and Jack had enough to fill 100 lifetimes.
The hunt became a cat-and-mouse game through corridors that shifted like liquid metal, the very walls seeming to resist their passage. Shadows leapt, twisted and coiled, while distant echoes carried sounds of grinding metal and whispers that made the crew shiver. Jack danced around traps with exaggerated gestures, flipping over broken beams, vaulting across gaps that would have swallowed ordinary men, all the while spinning jokes, taunts, and half-truths at the unseen horrors. "Keep up, mate," he called back, voice light, as the Pearl's crew struggled to keep pace. Every corner held peril, every corridor demanded cunning and improvisation, yet Jack's laughter rang clear, a beacon of chaos and charm cutting through the oppressive weight of centuries of malevolent energy. At last, the relic gleamed from atop a dais, encased in shifting energies that made it shimmer like liquid gold. Jack approached cautiously, one boot scraping the metal floor, sword twirling lightly in hand. He could feel the whispers of the warp around him, promising fortune, danger, and madness all at once. Gibbs glanced nervously, hand on his holstered weapon, while Jack tilted his hat and grinned. "Ha! There you are! I do love a good trinket." The moment was thick with tension, the relic pulsing as if aware of its observer, and Jack could almost feel it testing him, weighing his intentions, daring him to act. With a flourish and a crooked smile, he leaned closer, calculating, improvising, and relying on the blend of wit, luck, and audacity that had never failed him before.
Jack Sparrow had always preferred to work alone, yet the warp had a curious way of pairing the unpredictable with the impossible, and aboard the Black Pearl he now found himself joined by a motley assortment of allies, each stranger than the last. A rogue inquisitor, cloaked in shadowed robes and murmuring oaths that twisted the air with authority, studied Jack with thinly veiled suspicion. Across the deck, a chaos sorcerer, exiled from his own cult yet still radiating a dangerous aura, paced like a predator, weighing the value of his companions. And in the shadows, a cynical tech priest, servos whirring, eyes aglow with mechanical scrutiny, measured everything in calculations no human could comprehend. Gibbs muttered something about bad luck, but Jack grinned, tipping his hat. "Ah, mates, don't worry. Even the strangest crew can be useful, when you know how to use them," he said, voice smooth as rum. The Inquisitor, arms folded beneath layered robes, kept close, eyes scanning every movement Jack made with practiced suspicion. "You tread dangerous waters, pirate," he said, voice low but cutting, "and your luck will only carry you so far.
Jack chuckled, leaning casually against the rail, hat tilted, boots tapping lightly. "Ah, but you see, sir, luck is the only currency I've ever trusted, and it's never failed me. Yet." The Inquisitor's gaze narrowed, calculating, while Jack's grin widened. Even in the grim darkness of the 41st Millennium, where trust was rare and betrayal commonplace, Jack had an uncanny ability to inspire, infuriate, and manipulate simultaneously, and he sensed that this uneasy alliance, fragile as it was, would be more valuable than any blade or gun on the Pearl. The Chaos Sorcerer moved like a shadow, hands twitching with restrained power, eyes flicking constantly to Jack, assessing, probing, curious. "You have a presence. Even the warp acknowledges it. Perhaps you will be interesting." Jack bowed with a flourish, grinning wider than ever. "Interesting is my specialty, my friend. Dangerous perhaps too, but never dull." Gibbs muttered about fools and daemons, but Jack only laughed softly, reveling in the thrill of matching wits with someone who wielded the very essence of chaos like a blade. In the eerie glow of the warp-tainted void around them, the Black Pearl became a stage, and every gesture, word, and glance was a step in a complex dance between allies whose motives were as uncertain as the currents they sailed through.
The tech priest, his servo arms whirring and lenses glinting, measured Jack with quiet intensity, assessing probabilities and risks while muttering binary prayers to the machine god. Jack tipped his hat, smiling at the mechanical creature. "Ah, friend of gears and ghosts, I like your style, though I suspect you don't like mine." The tech priest's ocular implants glimmered, and for a moment a subtle nod indicated a begrudging acknowledgement. Jack chuckled, glancing over the deck at the assembled trio. "We may be an odd lot, mates, but a ship sails best when everyone paddles, or at least pretends to." Gibbs muttered that pretending would only get them killed faster, yet Jack thrived on this precarious balance, knowing that unpredictability, audacity, and a touch of charm were stronger than loyalty in this strange alliance. Together they moved through the void, negotiating strange currents, warp-tainted anomalies, and derelict stations where every shadow seemed alive. Jack led with a mix of theatrics and cunning, the Inquisitor following with sharp precision, the Sorcerer calculating angles of advantage with a glint of amusement, and the Tech Priest monitoring vital systems with mechanical exactitude. Each encounter was a test of patience, trust, and survival, and Jack, with his insatiable appetite for chaos and charm, found himself relying on each of these unlikely allies more than he ever admitted. "We'll get through this, mates, if only because I'm here to keep things lively," he said, voice rich with irony, glancing at Gibbs, who muttered prayers into the void. The first real trial came when a warp storm lashed at the Pearl, tugging at reality itself, threatening to tear the ship apart. Jack barked orders, half improvised, half instinctive, while the Inquisitor adjusted arcane instruments, whispering protective wards and curses. The Sorcerer muttered incantations that twisted the storm's edges, and the Tech Priest reinforced systems with precise, calculated motions. Together, though their methods clashed wildly, they stabilized the Pearl long enough to pass through. Jack leaned back against the rail, hat cocked, eyes sparkling. "See? Who said the strangest crew can't work?" The Inquisitor's lips tightened in grudging approval, the Sorcerer tilted his head in amused curiosity, and the Tech Priest whirred quietly, a subtle sign of acknowledgement. It was imperfect, chaotic, and thrilling, a reflection of Jack himself. By the time the storm faded, the crew had learned the peculiar rhythm of this alliance, each member unpredictable, dangerous, yet indispensable. Jack walked among them, sword twirling lightly, voice dripping with charm, drawing laughter, exasperation, and begrudging respect in equal measure. He knew that trust in the 41st Millennium was rare, yet even here in a maelstrom of warp and chaos, survival depended on alliances, however strange or uncomfortable. "We're a strange sort of family, mates," Jack said softly to Gibbs, eyes scanning the horizon. "But then again, I've always liked the unconventional. Makes life interesting."
The Black Pearl sailed through the shifting mists of the warp, the void around it writhing with colors that had no name, light that bent unnaturally, and shadows that moved with intent. Jack Sparrow perched on the helm, eyes narrowed, hat tilted at a rakish angle, as he felt the subtle tug of something malevolent closing in. Gibbs muttered prayers under his breath, clutching the rail as the sails flapped violently against a wind that seemed both real and imagined. A sudden ripple across the void made the timbers shiver, and Jack grinned, leaning casually against the wheel. "Ah, the welcoming committee's arrived," he murmured, voice smooth, eyes scanning for signs of movement. From the swirling darkness, shapes began to coalesce, forms both grotesque and impossible, their presence pressing on the mind with whispers of hunger and malice. The first of the Daemons emerged, a hulking creature with claws that glimmered with unnatural fire and eyes that burned like molten gold. It hovered just above the deck, its limbs twitching with erratic intent, and Jack instinctively spun his sword in one hand, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. Now, my friends, manners, if you please," he said, voice dripping with mock civility, even as the air trembled with psychic force. Gibbs froze, muttering about the end of days, but Jack only laughed softly, stepping lightly across the deck, boots sliding against the wet wood, dodging the creature's strikes with a combination of luck, instinct, and sheer audacity. The Daemons multiplied, shadows flickering along the warped timbers, yet Jack moved as if dancing, a single human against impossible odds, relying on wit as much as skill. The Black Pearl groaned as if it shared its captain's anticipation, timbers bending under the psychic stress radiating from the ambushes. Jack barked orders with casual flair, gesturing for the crew to fire flares and pivot cannons with improvised calculations, while the Daemons twisted and lunged, their forms partially insubstantial, partially terrifyingly real. Every swing of a sword, every leap across the deck was a gamble. Misstep meant obliteration, yet Jack moved with the confidence of a gambler used to cheating fate. Gibbs scrambled to follow, muttering curses as he swung weapons at phantoms that shimmered and reformed before his eyes. Jack's grin widened, eyes gleaming with the thrill of a fight where rules were suggestions and survival depended on cunning, speed, and luck. The warp itself seemed to respond to the chaos, currents twisting the Pearl's trajectory unpredictably, throwing sails taut, ropes tangling like serpents. Jack clung to the wheel, laughing, hat nearly falling off as he leaned into the storm, eyes scanning for openings. A Daemon lunged from above, claws raking the air, and he rolled beneath it, sword spinning in a mock flourish that somehow kept him unscathed. "Come now, let's not be hasty," he called, voice carrying over the roar of the warp, mocking the monstrous forms that hunted them. The crew followed, a mix of terror and trust, responding to Jack's audacious improvisation, and for a moment the ambush felt like a chaotic ballet with life and death as the rhythm. A sudden surge of energy slammed into the Pearl's starboard side, tossing the crew and sending Gibbs sliding across the deck. Jack grabbed a rope, swinging with dramatic grace as another Daemon struck from the shadows, its claws tearing at the wood. He landed lightly, sword twirling, eyes bright with mischief and calculation. "Ah, I do so love a bit of danger," he yelled, voice ringing with laughter, while the Daemons shrieked in frustration, their forms flickering as they struggled to grasp his unpredictable movements. The warp around them pulsed with malicious intent, yet Jack adapted, relying on instinct and audacity, moving as fluidly as the Black Pearl itself, a creature perfectly at home in the chaotic currents. The Black Pearl surged forward, sails catching currents that seemed to have a mind of their own. Jack barked directions, weaving through jagged shards of warped metal that floated like deadly obstacles, each maneuver an improvisation that relied on timing, luck, and nerve. The Daemons pursued relentlessly, claws scraping metal and tearing shadows as they lunged, but Jack anticipated their motions, taunting them with words and gestures, exploiting hesitation, confusion, and overconfidence. Gibbs grunted as he struggled to follow, muttering that Jack was mad. Yet the captain's laughter rang through the storm, guiding the crew with a mixture of charm, audacity, and instinct that defied logic and expectation. A final surge of psychic energy twisted the void, threatening to engulf the Pearl entirely, and Jack leapt to the helm, hands gripping the wheel as the ship responded like an extension of his own body. The Daemon shrieked, forms stretching and flickering, unable to predict his maneuvers, while the Black Pearl darted through the currents with impossible grace. Jack's grin never faltered. He danced with death itself, turning the ambush into a contest of skill, wit, and luck, each movement a statement of defiance against the impossible. Gibbs clutched the railing, muttering prayers, while Jack barked orders with flourish, commanding the ship and crew as if the very chaos were merely another deck to sail upon. And in the center of the warp's fury, he thrived.
The Black Pearl drifted into real space, leaving behind the twisting mists of the warp, only to be met by the grim silhouettes of Imperial warships, disciplined and gleaming with lethal precision. Jack Sparrow leaned against the helm, hat cocked, eyes twinkling with mischief as he assessed the cruisers arrayed against them like a phalanx of celestial predators. Gibbs muttered under his breath about the hopelessness of the situation, hands gripping the deck as though it might crumble beneath them, but Jack only grinned. "Ah, the universe's finest patience and discipline," he said, voice light, "and here I was thinking today might be dull." The Pearl floated like a rogue comet, sails sagging and timber creaking, yet Jack could feel the strange, subtle currents of luck, his oldest companion, nudging them toward improbable success. The Imperial ships opened with warning volleys, bright streaks of fire carving arcs through the void. Jack tipped his hat, laughing softly. Now that's an entrance. Cannon fire impacted near the Pearl, rattling her timbers and sending splinters across the deck, yet she held, responding to Jack's commands with the fluid, improbable grace that had carried her through the warp. Gibbs ducked, muttering prayers, while Jack danced across the deck, spinning his sword, eyes flicking from instrument panel to viewport, calculating angles of attack with the combination of luck, intuition, and audacity that defined him. Every flash of light, every rumble of firepower became part of the rhythm he moved to, turning the Pearl's apparent fragility into a weapon of unpredictability. Jack barked orders to the crew, improvising maneuvers that defied physics and logic. He leaned into the wheel as the Pearl twisted between volleys, sails flaring like the wings of a bird caught in a storm. "Left, no, right, no, always with the dramatic flair, mates." His voice carried over the roar of explosions and the hum of energy shields as Imperial officers furrowed their brows, trying to anticipate the pirates' next move. Gibbs scrambled to follow, muttering curses about the absurdity of fighting men who flirted with certain death, while Jack's grin never faltered. Every dodge, every weave was a calculated performance designed to frustrate, confuse, and entertain both crew and pursuers. One of the cruisers unleashed a beam that tore through the void, aimed precisely at the Pearl. Jack's eyes widened briefly, just enough for Gibbs to notice. Then he laughed, ducking beneath the railing as the ship twisted on its axis. "Nothing like a close shave to make one feel alive," he called, sword spinning, hat nearly falling off. The beam struck the void just ahead of the ship, splintering an asteroid nearby into glowing fragments that tumbled past, creating temporary cover. Jack's mind raced, exploiting every opportunity the chaos provided, turning debris into shields, timing his maneuvers with the precision of a dancer performing on a floor that could collapse at any moment. The Imperial ships adjusted, firing in coordinated volleys that sought to trap the Pearl in a deadly pincer. Jack laughed, stepping lightly across the deck, Hap tilted, eyes glinting with amusement, and gestured to Gibbs. "Do keep up, mate, or you'll miss the fun!" The Pearl twisted through the formations, spinning cannon fire into impossible arcs, raking the enemy with countermeasures and flares. Sparks danced along the deck as impacts glanced harmlessly off reinforced timber, the ship seeming to anticipate its captain's wild whims. Gibbs grunted as he swung a rope to steady himself, muttering about impossible odds, while Jack only grinned, moving as though the battle were a game of cards, every maneuver a calculated bluff against the Empire's might. A sudden, daring move saw Jack loop the Pearl in a tight spiral around a damaged cruiser, flares illuminating the void, giving the impression of chaotic fire that masked the ship's true trajectory. Imperial gunners recalculated frantically, unable to predict the Pearl's erratic dance. Jack's voice rang out, teasing the unseen officers. "You've got to keep up, lads, or you'll miss the spectacle entirely." Gibbs ducked under a swinging beam, shouting in exasperation, while Jack leaned over the rail, watching the cruiser's flanks open in vulnerability, eyes bright with the thrill of defiance. The Pearl's unpredictable movement turned each attack into a near miss, and every near miss into a calculated advantage, a testament to audacity and improvisation over discipline and firepower. The battle escalated, beams and missiles flashing, creating a storm of light and fire that reflected in Jack's eyes as he danced across the deck. The Pearl twisted, dodged, and weaved, responding with impossible agility, each maneuver a gamble that relied on chance, wit, and instinct. "Nothing like a bit of chaos to keep the Empire on its toes," he said, voice ringing across the decks, hat spinning on his head as if celebrating the audacity of survival. Gibbs muttered about being cursed, while Jack spun his sword, eyes sparkling, moving with the fluidity of one who understood that in this universe, luck, charm, and audacity could outmaneuver even the deadliest fleets.
Jack Sparrow had always considered himself a man of flexible morals, guided more by instinct, charm, and the occasional pang of conscience than by law or duty. Yet the 41st Millennium tested even the most adaptable hearts. After a skirmish with Imperial forces and a narrow escape from a Daemon ambush, Jack found himself standing on a barren moon, the horizon glowing faintly with the corruption of chaos. Shadows twisted unnaturally across the ground, and the whispers of the warp slithered around him, promising power, wealth, and ruin in equal measure. Gibbs muttered prayers, pacing nervously behind him, while Jack tilted his hat back and squinted at the desolate landscape, wondering if a pirate's wit and luck were enough to navigate the murky waters of morality in a galaxy that had long forgotten such concepts. In the distance, a small group of human survivors huddled among shattered ruins, faces gaunt, eyes hollow, and desperation etched into every gesture. Jack's first instinct was to keep moving, to prioritize the Pearl and the crew above all else, yet a pang of conscience tugged at him, as unpredictable and persistent as the warp itself. "We can't just leave them," he muttered to Gibbs, though his tone was half jest, half calculation. The survivors looked like ghosts caught between hunger and terror, and Jack could feel the moral weight pressing against his usual irreverence. Even he, the master of audacity and chaos, had lines he struggled to navigate, and in the grim darkness of this universe, those lines were slippery and often deadly. Approaching cautiously, Jack raised his hands, voice smooth and charismatic. "Evening, mates," he called out, eyes scanning for signs of aggression or deceit. "I'm Jack Sparrow, and I tend to get involved where trouble brews, though not always for free." The survivors flinched, mistrust written across every movement, yet Jack persisted, weaving words like nets, balancing charm with subtle threats, improvisation with empathy. Gibbs muttered that the poor souls would be devoured by their own fear before Jack could help, but the pirate's grin never wavered. He thrived on walking the edge between danger and morality, where wit, luck, and human touch were as important as swords and firepower.
Chaos was never far, a malignant presence twisting the very ground beneath them. Jack could feel the whispers brushing against his mind, tempting him with shortcuts and easy solutions that promised wealth, safety, or power at the cost of human lives. He laughed softly, a sound tinged with both amusement and defiance, as he realized the true test wasn't the monsters in front of him, but the choices he would make in their presence. Every decision, help, exploit, flee, or bargain, carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Gibbs muttered about sins and damnation, yet Jack leaned forward, eyes bright with the thrill of moral improvisation, understanding that in the 41st millennium, right and wrong were rarely clear, and survival often demanded a compromise with conscience itself. A sudden noise made them all freeze. A shadow flitted across the ruins, and Jack's instinct screamed danger. He moved with exaggerated grace, sword in hand, hat tilted, eyes scanning the horizon for the source. A daemon, its form twisted and grotesque, emerged from the darkness, claws glinting, eyes burning with malice. Jack's first thought was to escape, to protect the Pearl and the crew, but the survivors' terrified faces anchored him, forcing a split in his instinct. He lunged forward with a calculated swing, dodging the creature's attack and simultaneously gesturing for the humans to follow him. Gibbs muttered that they were mad, yet Jack's grin widened. Chaos and morality danced together, and he was determined to lead the dance, even when the music was as lethal as warp-tainted air. As the daemon lunged again, Jack's voice rang out, sharp, playful, and commanding. "Move, now! Keep up or you'll be tasting metal faster than you can say rum!" The survivors hesitated, torn between fear and trust, but Jack's audacity drew them forward, a lifeline threaded through the chaos. Every step was a negotiation between survival and morality, audacity and responsibility. Gibbs followed, grumbling, but Jack's presence seemed to anchor the humans in ways words alone could not. The warp pressed at their minds, whispering promises and threats, yet Jack's chaotic charisma, combined with instinctive bravery, became the thread connecting life and action, guiding them through the thin line between choice and consequence. At the edge of the ruins, another decision arose. A bridge of precarious metal beams spanned a chasm that pulsed with warp energy. The survivors faltered, eyes wide, and Jack realized the weight of leadership pressed on him. He could take the easy path, leave them, or risk everything to save lives not his own. A crooked smile tugged at his lips as he held out a hand, voice light yet commanding. "Come along, mates. No time for hesitation." Gibbs muttered about fools and miracles, while Jack's grin grew, knowing that leadership in the 41st millennium was a gamble where morality and audacity collided in equal measure. Every choice, every gesture was a test of human touch in a galaxy dominated by incomprehensible forces.
The Black Pearl, battered but unbroken, drifted through the void like a rogue comet, leaving a trail of whispered stories in its wake. Jack Sparrow stood at the helm, hat tilted, eyes bright with mischief and experience, as the distant glow of planets, stars, and warp currents painted the void in impossible colors. Tales of the pirate who dared to challenge demons, outwit Imperial fleets, and bargain with Xenos had already begun to spread among the scattered human colonies, whispered in hushed tones by those who had glimpsed the improbable. Jack grinned, tipping his hat to the void itself, as if acknowledging that the legend was less about him and more about the absurdity of survival, audacity, and wit in a galaxy that had forgotten such qualities existed. Gibbs muttered that legends rarely lived, yet Jack only laughed softly, eyes scanning the horizon for the next impossible adventure. Every port, every ruined station, every forgotten outpost had its version of the story. The pirate who danced through the warp with uncanny luck, who bargained with aliens and outwitted demons, who led a motley crew against the mightiest forces in the galaxy with nothing but charm, sword, and audacity. Jack listened to fragments of these stories as he wandered the decks, spinning his sword lazily, voice carrying over the creaking timbers. "Ah, so I'm famous, am I? Delightful," he murmured, grinning wider than ever. Even in the grim darkness of the 41st Millennium, where legends were often forged in blood and tragedy, his was a story of wit, improvisation, and improbable survival, a tale that blurred the line between heroism and irreverence, luck and skill. The Imperium, as always, was watching, whispering of the pirate who eluded fleets and defied the rules of engagement with audacity that seemed almost supernatural. Imperial officers debated whether he was a threat, a curiosity, or a trick of the warp itself, and Jack, ever perceptive, reveled in the uncertainty. Gibbs muttered that the galaxy would be better off without him, yet Jack only smiled, leaning on the rail, hat shadowing a mischievous glint in his eyes. Every daring escape, every improbable negotiation, every battle fought against demons or the Imperium itself added layers to the legend, transforming him into a figure that could be myth, cautionary tale, or hero, depending on who told it. Among the Xenos, too, Jack's reputation grew, strange tales drifting through the void like sparks across metal. Eldar skimmers whispered of the human who bargained for curiosities and survived. Orks told stories in guttural tones of a pirate who laughed at death and made fools of their wardans. Tau fleets recorded anomalies in their data, noting a rogue element that consistently evaded capture while sowing chaos. Jack listened with amusement, spinning his sword and tilting his hat. "Ah, so they've taken notice as well," he said to Gibbs, voice rich with irony. "Quite flattering, really. Makes one wonder whether it's fame or folly that keeps me alive." The Pearl hummed beneath him, responding to its captain with the loyalty only a ship built for chaos and improvisation could provide. Legends, Jack realized, were not merely built on deeds alone, but on perception, audacity, and timing. Each narrow escape, each clever bargain, each battle turned into a story of improbable survival, yet the truth behind it was always layered with improvisation and risk. He remembered the daemonic ambush, the Imperial pursuit, the negotiations with Xenos, and the moral dilemmas that had forced him to make choices that were neither right nor wrong, but necessary for survival. Gibbs muttered about the madness of it all, while Jack's grin only widened. A legend, he mused aloud, is simply a story people choose to believe, seasoned with luck, and told well enough to survive the telling. Even the warp itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, subtle currents shifting around the Pearl as if granting passage to a creature who had learned its rhythms, who danced on its edges with confidence and flair. Jack leaned against the rail, sword spinning lightly in one hand, eyes scanning the impossible horizon. Gibbs watched nervously, muttering prayers, but Jack only laughed softly, reveling in the absurdity that defined him. The Black Pearl, its timbers groaning in agreement, carried him forward through the void, and each encounter added to the legend. The pirate who challenged the impossible and survived, the human who treated chaos as a dance, who made friends and enemies alike pause and reconsider their assumptions. As stories of Jack Sparrow spread across the void, both whispered and shouted, he found amusement in the interpretations. Some called him hero, some fool, others called him devil, yet he moved through it all with a grin, hat tilted, sword twirling, fully aware that legend was a matter of perception, not truth. Gibbs muttered that perception wouldn't stop a plasma bolt, yet Jack's eyes sparkled with the thrill of the impossible, knowing that survival in the 41st millennium required more than courage. It demanded audacity, improvisation, and the ability to charm fate itself. And Jack, ever irreverent, had all three in abundance.